this afternoon, very busy afternoon already. This is the Stein Rokkan Lecture, which is a tradition at the ECPR joint sessions. I'm Jean-Michel Eymeri-Douzans, one of the organizers of these sessions. Here I will be chairing this session. I will first give the floor to my dear friend Sabine Saureger, the rector of Sciences Po Grenoble, not Toulouse, and who is a member of the committee of the ECPR. Sabine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. I would like to start by saying how happy I am to be here and to have the pleasure and the honor to introduce this year's Stein Rokkan Guest Lecture, a lecture which traditionally takes place every year at the joint sessions. And today I'm particularly moved to be able to introduce the guest speaker, Béatrice Hibou, Director of Research at Sciences Po Paris, who will talk to us about the work and fate of Fariba Adelkhah. Fariba is a Director of Research in Anthropology at Sciences Po Paris, and she's a specialist of the social practices of religious movements and currently held in Iran without the possibility to leave the country. Today's Stein Rokkan Lecture will make a very strong link with the ECPR's working group on academic freedom, chaired by our colleague Daniela Herrera. ECPR strongly mobilizes, as you probably know, to defend academic freedom, whether through the organization of symposiums, roundtables, conferences, or by taking positions in the public debate, or by advocacy actions vis-à-vis decision makers. It is therefore with, and I stop here, great pleasure that I give first the floor to my colleague and friend, Vice Rector Jean-Michel Eymeri-Douzans, who will introduce Béatrice Hibou and Fariba Adelkhah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my dear. Yes, indeed, this is a very special moment for us on the occasion of this year's joint sessions of workshops in Toulouse. We all know that academic freedom is more and more attacked in our strange postmodern, post-truth world by all means and all sorts of powers. Such a catastrophic trend is developing on all continents and, surprisingly, not only in countries suffering under the rule of dictatorships, but also in our democracies contested from outside and inside by the dark forces of neo-obscurantism. Liberty of thinking, liberty of talking, liberty of publishing, and what the French political philosophers of the Enlightenment, the Lumière, the Aufklärung, baptized esprit critique. As Michel Foucault, among others, used to underline constantly, esprit critique, critical thinking, is probably with curiosity and rigorous honesty one of the three main characteristics of any good researcher, or at least honest, honorable researcher. And precisely it is because our dear colleague, Dr. Fariba Adelkhah, demonstrated too much esprit critique, according to the authorities of Iran, that she was arrested with her colleague and companion Roland Marshall on the 14th of July 2019, a date of arrest that was anything but accidental, as it is the French National Day. Since then, the French Republic makes constant efforts to try and get Fariba back to the French soil without success. If Roland Marshall is released since March 2020, Fariba remains, as our guests will explain, a scientific prisoner, so to speak, in Iran. Many colleagues in France and in other countries have quickly created a support committee for Fariba, and Béatrice Hibou is very active in this committee. And that's why she was probably the best person to represent her today here, since, of course, Fariba cannot be with us today, couldn't even send us a message, that's for sure. I will briefly introduce Béatrice, whom we thank very much for being with us, and we thank also for everything, and especially for contributing to that combat for academic freedom. Béatrice is a senior research fellow at the National Center for Scientific Research, which means in the French academic jargon, a high-level research professor. She is one of the most cited French political scientists, by the way. She graduated from Sciences Po Paris. She took her PhD from another grande école, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, with a thesis dedicated to the political economy of protection in Africa, and then the habilitation at Sciences Po Paris. She belongs there to a famous labo, the CERI, le Centre d'études et de recherche internationale, and she teaches at Sciences Po Paris and the EHESS. Béatrice has many responsibilities in editorial boards at many scientific journals. She is the editor of an important series with scientific publishing houses, such as Cartala in particular. She is a co-founder and vice president of FASOPO, le Fonds d'analyse des sociétés contemporaines, which is an important undertaking dedicated to the promotion of comparative political sociology. She has authored or co-authored and edited 10 volumes and a great number of articles at the best journals. To put things in a nutshell, our friend Béatrice develops a comparative research in political economy and society in a rather neo-Weberian conception, investigating the ongoing transformations of the state, the spread of neoliberalism as a technology of power, all sorts of social movements, political transformations, and economic actors in Europe, as well as in the Maghreb, Mashrek, and sub-Saharan cases, with an epistemological perspective influenced by Max Weber, Norbert Elias, Michel Foucault, and Pierre Bourdieu. Béatrice is a great researcher, and may I add, a wonderful and generous person. It is thus a privilege to have you with us today. Dear Béatrice, and the floor now is yours.
Thank you so much, Jean-Michel, for your too generous presentation. I would like to begin this lecture by thanking Sciences Po Toulouse, and in particular its director, Eymeri-Douzans, and its deputy director, Jean-Michel Eymeri-Douzans, for inviting me to speak about a subject that is very close to my heart and that I consider to be of primary importance. I would also like to thank the ECPR board of directors who enthusiastically accepted my proposal. Thank you all. As you know, it's not me who should be here talking to you, but Fariba Adelkhah. A French researcher knows Fariba Adelkhah well, for whom we are fighting for a release for almost 4 years. But for our foreign colleagues, I would like to recall a situation. Fariba Adelkhah is an anthropologist at Sciences Po of dual Iranian and French nationality. She is a leading scholar of Iran and Afghanistan. She has studied religious practices, economic dynamics, and the formation of the nation, particularly through mobility. As she had done regularly since her doctoral studies and her recruitment as a researcher at Sciences Po in 1993, Fariba Adelkhah was conducting a long-term research visit devoted to the transnational circulation of Shiite clerics between Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. In addition, she was engaged in a legal and theological studies about the law of purification, Taharat, with a teacher in the holy city of Rome and preparing for an international conference on borders. It was in her role as a researcher and solely based on her anthropological work that she was arrested at Tehran airport on 5 June 2019, as she was waiting for Roland Marshall, her Sciences Po colleague, who is also a partner, who was also arrested on leaving his plane. Alongside an American citizen, Roland Marshall was later released as part of a prisoner swap on 20 March 2020. They were exchanged for an Iranian engineer arrested in France in May 2019 on the basis of an international arrest warrant issued by the United States, where he was due to be extradited. Fariba Adelkhah, meanwhile, is still sentenced to be deprived for freedom for 5 years, following a parody of trial without the slightest respect for the judicial procedures in force in Iran or the constitutional provisions of the Islamic Republic of Iran. She had no access to her judicial file. She was not allowed any real assistance from a lawyer, and she had no consular protection from France, as Iran does not recognize dual nationality and consider her an Iranian citizen. Kept in solitary confinement from 5 June until the end of December 2019, Fariba Adelkhah was interrogated harshly by investigators from the Revolutionary Guards, Gardiens de la Révolution, about her professional activities, which were treated as espionage, disinformation, destabilization of Iranian institutions, and breaches on national security. Her computer equipment, documents, address books containing all her professional contacts were confiscated and have never been returned to her. On 11 February 2023, so 2 months ago, she was granted a pardon along with thousands of Iranian prisoners, and she is now free. But this freedom is only theoretical. Not only can Fariba not practice her profession, but she has not covered any of her documents or means of work that were confiscated. Without documents, she cannot leave Iran and return to Paris to meet her family, and above all, to return to Sciences Po and her profession. So why is Fariba's case emblematic of this fight for scientific freedom that brings so many of us together? I would like to show this in 3 steps. The first one, the first level, is the simplest, the most obvious, the most self-evident, is that of political conditions outside the academic world, and which refers to authoritarian situations. Indeed, during her interrogations, Fariba was questioned exclusively about her research activities, and it's why also we constantly argued for her to be considered as a scientific prisoner and not a political prisoner. She has faced and continues to face a complete misunderstanding of what social science research is. For her interrogators, and more broadly for the regime, research must be viewed with suspicion whenever it's critical, and all the more so when the researcher belongs to a foreign institution. Research is considered to be espionage, undermining national security, propaganda against the regime. Fariba was not passive during these interrogations. She spent whole nights in vain explaining to them what scientific social research was, how it was protected in the West, and what a free and critical look at society could bring. This is not a new suspicion. On several occasions since the 90s, her passport was confiscated at Tehran airport, and she was interrogated by agents from the Ministry of Intelligence. She has rebuffed all the requests for collaboration she has received. She knew that she was followed closely by the Iranian security services when she did field work in Afghanistan and Iran, and had nothing to hide for them. She even wanted this actor to understand what she was doing, with the idea of promoting a status of research in Iran and the legitimacy of the research profession. A response to the political suspicion or accusation leveled at her by the Iranian authorities has been to point out the public nature of her work, which anyone can access, as it is published in journals and by scientific publishers. She has even taken care to translate summaries of her work into Persian so that Iranian readers can consult them easily. And during her time in prison, she paid a translator to translate one of her books, Being Modern in Iran, published in French and in English, into Persian. But it has not yet found a publisher. For Fariba, what is missing from the Iranian situation is the recognition of research as a profession. In a society organized into guilds, that is minimally institutional forms of organizing professions, the fact that a whole field, scientific research, does not benefit from any specific recognition makes it fragile and leaves it under the control of the state monopoly. A threefold monopoly: the monopoly of legitimate thought, the monopoly of legitimate research methods, and the monopoly of its dissemination. This lack of recognition and organization of research leaves Iranian researchers in an extremely fragile state. The difference between the world of journalism and the world of research is striking. In today's turbulent Iran, journalists have mobilized to defend two of their own imprisoned for having spread information about the death of Masha Amini. Not a single researcher has spoken out in defense of Fariba, and even beyond her case, in the defense of the activity of research. Fariba found herself alone in defending her profession when, in 2007, the academic Ken Tashbash was arrested and convicted of espionage and undermining national security. She published a paper in which she defended the freedom of research by criticizing the terms of treason and service to the nation. In 2010, Fariba found herself alone again when she wrote an open letter in Persian to the President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to protest against the conviction for espionage of the French PhD student Clotilde Reiss on the treatment of academic research as espionage, spying. Unfortunately, the Iranian situation is not isolated. Save researcher, save research to save history, or save research, save history to save freedom. These statements, which Fariba made the core of her demand when she went on hunger strike, are not only aimed at Iran, are not only aimed at the most violent police and judicial repression in authoritarian countries, but are also aimed at more insidious threats. It's aimed first and foremost at the most violent police and judicial repression in authoritarian countries, of which the assassination of Giulio Regeni by the Egyptian security services is the most emblematic illustration. But which should not make us forget the fact that in Turkey, the academics for peace have been expelled from university and dismissed with no resource to live on. Chinese researchers working on Uyghurs or Muslim minorities, but also working on COVID, have been persecuted and prevented from continuing their research. Russian academics who question the special operation in Ukraine or question the government's discourse on history are ostracized, excluded, or imprisoned. and we all remember the attacks and then the dissolution of the association Memorial. A researcher can be imprisoned for undermining national security or for terrorism in many Gulf countries, but also in Asia and Latin America. But this statement also covers less obvious and apparently less violent attacks, at least physically. With the denunciation of wokeism, Islamo-gauchism, Islamo-leftism or ultra-left, with the criminalization of research on sensitive subjects, such as, for example, the participation during the Second World War on genocide in Poland, or before in Turkey with the Armenians, with the subjugation of universities in Hungary, which led to the departure of the Central European University funded by Soros Open Society, and with suspicion and even criminalization of issues considered sensitive or political, such as environmental issue or jihad and political Islam in Western democracies. In general, we can see that governments are taking an increasing direct interest in knowledge. On the one hand, scientific research is seen as espionage, an attack on national security or even national identity, as I have pointed out at length. On the other hand, scientific activity in social science is viewed with suspicion as soon as it expresses itself in its very essence, challenge and call into question, propose new problematization that are not those of political power or common sense. Thus, for example, in France, even so there is a protective status for researchers, we can remember that the former Prime Minister Manuel Valls said with regard to research on political Islam that explaining is already justifying. Even so, we know that understanding has nothing to do with forgiveness or approval. All around Europe, we can also remember that attempts to restrict access to archives, for example. The specificity of scientific freedom is the specificity of knowledge produced by researchers. Knowledge that is above all the result of distancing, of the naturalization and displacement of the limits of understanding. Knowledge that finds its legitimacy not in the name of the truth accredited by any authority, but rather by virtue of methodological rigor and empirical solidity on which it's based. So this specificity is often difficult to accept from the political powers, insofar as Max Weber recalls us, scientific knowledge is only valid for those who want to believe in scientific truth. However, these are not the only attacks. Fariba's case is emblematic of the fight for scientific freedom at a second level, or for a second reason. Her experience shows that the challenge to scientific freedom does not come only from the regime, but can also come from society, and perhaps even especially from the academic world. This brings us back to the question of internal condition of our profession, and more precisely to the conflicts regarding the conception of research and science. For years, Fariba was interrogated, kept under surveillance and intimidated, but she was also criticized and widely ostracized by her colleagues in Iran, but also in France, in Europe, in the United States. In a way, she may not have been sufficiently vigilant about the risk of repression by the Iranian state, because the difficulty she experienced in her work came first and foremost from the scientific world itself. it's interesting to look back at her work on religious anthropology to understand the logic of this marginalization, which is emblematic of a certain conception of research. Indeed, when the Islamic Republic of Iran was established, the great American historian Nikki Keddie made a statement that had remained in people's memory. As long as there is a republic, we can no longer talk about people's religion. This was a way of saying that the republic has a monopoly on this issue, and that in an Islamic society, you cannot talk about religion. However, through a religious anthropology, she works on veil, on pilgrimage, on loans at interest, on donation, on charities, on daily religiosity. Fariba has precisely challenged this paradigm, internalized by the society and by the researchers. She has shown that people's behaviors were far more complex than mere submission to the state. All her work highlighted the fact that there was a lot going on beyond this attempted state monopoly on religiosity of Iranian men and women, and Fariba work mainly on women. But it's not only the state that has not received this work well, not only society, public opinion, or political correctness. The depreciation of her work and the choice of this research topic came first from her colleagues. Her research was not legitimate. It was not legitimate for some because religion was a domain of the state, and therefore to go and look at it was to legitimate the state. For others, since Fariba has shown that it was not a question of power, but of a society, and that these religious practices also refer to issues of modernization, contestation, or at least distancing from the state, her work amounted to a critique of the state, since she sociologized and therefore desacralized religion. What was poorly received, therefore, was not only the fact of working on a topic that was devalued and even taboo for intellectuals, religion, but also the way in which it was done through an anthropology and politics from below, by showing the room of maneuver and even a certain amount of freedom and energy, and in any case, a dynamic and strategy of invention within an imposed framework. If this experience speaks about authoritarianism, it also speaks of the effects of the monopoly on society, and in particular on what is expected of research. Not the production of new knowledge, not a decentering of the gaze, but the response to demands that are already there and formatted both by the state and by society. Not the highlighting of plural and antagonistic logics that govern the world, of the ins and outs of judgment and position, not recognition of the fundamental heterogeneity of the establishment of facts, states of affairs, or logic, but the justification of a given order. Not learning to recognize unpleasant facts, to speak as Max Weber, that is to say the facts that are unpleasant to one's own opinion or conviction, but the avoidance of questions that might bring them to light. But this experience also tells us about how conception of research and scientific activity may differ. Indeed, what does doing science mean? For some, it is, in a given questioning, a matter of technical knowledge, the mastery of technical know-how, and ever more advanced refinement of this technical know-how, as is the case today massively of legitimacy through quantification techniques. For others, doing science is a matter of methods, of protocol that must be followed with rigor, as is a certain trend today towards the formalization of investigation or, for example, the codification of ethics. Finally, for others, and I make no secret of the fact that I am one of them, doing science means above all offering innovative problematization, producing knowledge that is above all the result of distancing oneself, shifting the limits of understanding and learning to denaturalize, including by questioning agreed methods. In science as a profession, Max Weber even spoke of strange drunkenness, of passion as a precondition for inspiration. He reminds us that the science of culture, what we call today humanities and social sciences, are not a matter of arithmetic, but a matter of ideas that have nothing to do with cold calculation. Adding that, of course, calculation is also necessary, but that ideas about the direction of the calculation and the scope of the results are needed above all. For him, ideas do not come from nowhere, they come from a lot of work, but ideas do not replace work. It's work and passion together that attract ideas. The latter do not come when we want them to, but when they please, often by chance, after long journeys, rumination on a old underground world. These different conceptions can cause tension in the scientific world. This can be seen in the way the terms innovation and expertise have invaded our profession. For the former, these terms are equivalent to research in a technical conception of science, and often an utilitarian conception of it. On the contrary, for those who think that scientific research is about knowledge, about the criticism of judgment, by showing what kinds of problems are hidden behind judgments, innovation and expertise cannot be confused with scientific research at the risk of concealing the fundamental issue of ends, and you see that here again very Weberian, and meaning and on the relationship to position taken. This tension can be seen also in the tendency to withdraw into discipline, even so for the advocates of science as the overcoming of the limits of the understanding, the construction of new questions, and with them adequate methodological approaches cannot be satisfied by respecting the specialization and purity of disciplines, nor by slicing up teams on methodological reflection detached from research questions. Of course, the specificity of knowledge produced by researchers is the method, a method that must be both explicit and rigorous in terms of the approach that researchers adopt to grasp their question. Over time, that's not been uncommon for social science researchers to free themselves from the method specific to their discipline, to free themselves from the consolidated canons in the approach to this or that phenomenon, precisely in order to renew their understanding of it. The strategies employed by social scientists to overcome political and social constraints are often informed by methodology. When researchers cannot freely choose their point of entry into their fieldwork, the freedom to define their own methods makes it possible to overcome obstacles in the pursuit of knowledge that is emancipated from red lines and conception of social taboos and defies the political correctness. And this is what explains the originality and innovative dimension of a certain amount of research on Africa, for example, compared to the mainstream. What if, when faced with situations that are likely to be politically or socially contentious, exercising such methodological autonomy granted researcher a freedom? For allowing researchers to take the freedom to defy political, social, and professional customs, when epistemological reason require it, research must be accepted as an act of creation. The pursuit of knowledge is an act of creation insofar as a researcher does not seek to translate reality in its supposed objectivity, but rather to propose a reasoning, an interpretation, or a problematization of it. This act of creation is not the product of a single individual effort, however. Only prosperous, independent scientific institutions can defend and support research that is understood as an act of creation, emancipated from the constraint of funding on a productive and utilitarian approach. The development of social meanings that permit researchers to act freely is not a matter of individual choice. The task of constructing the condition that would allow the deviation from political custom, exception to social norm, and innovation from among professional norms must be a collective responsibility. The consequences of this conception of research is to understand academic knowledge as a counterpower to political knowledge, journalistic knowledge, the knowledge of economic and financial interests. Distancing oneself, denaturalizing false evidence on the intellectual categories of common sense, shifting the limits of scientific understanding, doubt, and nonconformism, the courage to go against the tide and challenge received ideas, all this is the raison d'être of research, which, as Weber said, makes a problem of what is obvious by convention. Finally, and this is the third point, Fariba's experience suggests the importance of reflecting on the current condition of the exercise of our profession and their specificity, especially in comparison to previous decades. In other words, to reflect on the effect of the rise of ideology and its implication for research. In fact, Fariba was arrested and imprisoned in 2019, even though she has been conducting research in Iran since the mid-80s. One is forced to ask what has changed, what has become unacceptable to the authorities in the exercise of our research activities. To answer this question, we need to think not only at the level of politics in Iran, but also at the international level. In Iran, the new generation in power, born of the Iran-Iraq war, has little in common with the generation that made the '79 revolution, even if it continues to suffer the economic, financial, and political consequences of ostracism and international sanction and the freezing of Iranian assets. Faced with this immobility, the strategy of the authority has become increasingly radical, with the failure of the reformers and the gradual rise in power of the Revolutionary Guards, who have decided to change their strategy. Change of strategy vis-à-vis the international community, and which we see with the hardening of politics and the whole hostage policy. You may know that there is seven French that are state hostage of Iran nowadays. But change also internally vis-à-vis their competitors, which explains the presence everywhere in society. The revolutionary growths are in the financial and economic areas, of course, but also in sectors where they have nothing material to gain, like research. Before Fariba, other researchers were imprisoned, such as Omar Woodford, Kian Kashbash, Clotilde Rice, Stéphane Dudoignon, or Ramin Jahanbeglou. But this transformation was not spontaneous. It's also the result of the intransigence of American politics and with it European politics for the mid-2000 onwards, particularly under the impact of the rise of the libertarian and conservative forces and its political expression, the Tea Party and then Trumpism, and under the deleterious weight of the Iranian diaspora in the West. I am not going to return to this extremely complex issue here, and I am not a specialist of Iran, even if for 4 years now I started to understand something. But it was important to recall them because they underline a final point that I would like to mention, that of the influence of ideology on the condition for the exercise of research, including in our Western democracy. The impact of ideology on the exercise of scientific research can be seen, as I pointed out in the first part of my lecture, in the increasing criminalization of researchers working on subjects considered sensitive. But ideology can also be more insidious, playing out in a way that is all the more subtle because it conceals its ideological dimension and presents itself as technical, rational, apolitical. However, to continue with Weberian references, but we could also mention critical theory, for example, Marcuse or the work of Michel Foucault, as Jean-Michel remembered it. Scientific research must also bring clarity in the distinction between science and judgment, science and conviction. In two of the essays on the theory of science, the one on axiological neutrality and the one on objectivity, Weber reminds us that it's not a question of discrediting the expression of conviction for the benefit of scientific activity alone, but that the two registers, the two provinces of the mind, as he called them, must not be confused. It's within this framework that Weber criticized result-centered ethics, that he criticized a conception of action centered exclusively on its value in conviction, which is a criticism of relying on science in place of ethical reflection. We cannot allow ourselves to be locked into purely technical issues that evacuate the central question of ends. But the task of science is precisely to criticize this judgment by showing what kinds of problems lie behind them. This is not the place to give a lecture on this text, but we can understand the interest of recalling the development that Weber had proposed on the meaning of science. Weber emphasized the importance of analyzing what lies behind policies, behind reforms that are always presented in a technical manner, whereas they refer to conviction, values, and value judgments. There is perhaps the most urgent thing to do today to bring to light the central question of ends. And these ends, this conviction, these values behind, for example, the reforms, university reforms and technical problems that affect the world of science today are those of efficiency, quality, productivity, competition, and competitiveness. These are also the values of reform that express conviction. The conviction of the economic and social usefulness of science, human capital as an ideology with an economic and capitalist vision of knowledge, inequality assumed as engine of progress. We can recall some of these tendencies which today in our university challenge scientific research, an utilitarian and commodified conception of research that must be managed as enterprise through calls for tenders and projects by responding to social demand and taking into account the interest of the main players of the knowledge economy, and with a definition often bureaucratic or at least external of what are the useful topics of interest for knowledge economy and for the political and social interest of the nation. A university that must be productive, and for this to happen, research must be carried out over a short and programmed period of time. This is fed by a whole series of current logics, as the project logics, the precarious status and short-term contracts, the 3-year thesis rule, and the race for publication. A whole organization which makes it difficult to accept lost time, byways, moments of latency, change, and underground work. It's difficult also to carry out field research, like Fariba is doing, field research, especially but not only in remote areas, which require time and slowness to establish relationship and trust and to get to know a society. An entrepreneurial vision of research with, in order to be both productive and in line with the canons of the large managerial enterprise, must be privatized. And we see this with the rise of private funding or the funding from other states. And there is a very big problem nowadays with the Gulf states that are financing the research on the MENA zone, or China for research on the Chinese continent. But also funding from public administration, which are with different objectives that pure research, like funding from the Ministry of Army, Defense, Foreign Affairs, etc. The rise in power of agency and state political bodies for guiding or regulating research to the detriment of research center and collegiate peer committees, logic of competition, commodification, and entrepreneurialization of research through precarization of research work, especially for young people, etc., etc. All these trends, and no doubt other that I am forgetting, outline the internal constraints that the world of scientific research is experiencing today in countries where academic knowledge is institutionalized. These constraints limit its freedom because they are difficult to overcome and to circumvent, because above all, they call into question fundamental principles. Accepting not knowing where we are going and not expecting results, accepting that research can take years or even decades to produce something, and ensuring the economic viability of research in the long term, that is, benefiting from public funding dedicated to research without targeting or specific orientation. These attacks on freedom are obviously less violent and, above all, less immediately visible than political and security attacks. But they can be even more deleterious because of their invisibilization and internalization by researchers themselves. They stem from different logics that give research a different status and, above all, a different meaning. In Iran, the state does not care about science per se and simply wants to monopolize these fields it tries to monopolize all other fields. In Western democracy, the state tries to commodify and other science because it considers science a fundamental element of knowledge economy at the heart of progress. So it's time to conclude. And I wanted to say that for the past 4 years, we have been saying, Fariba, your struggle is our struggle. Not just to express our affection and solidarity, but because the intellectual and moral integrity, the thirst for independence from all forms of power that Fariba never ceased to demonstrate throughout her career and even within the walls of Evin prison, constitute a powerful lesson and oblige us. It obliges us to constantly reflect on the exercise of our profession and to preserve our independence in order to continue to make science an act of freedom, a freedom that is increasingly important in the world in which we live, including in France, where the wind of a challenge to public freedom and academic freedom by the political authorities is lurking, following the example of what is already happening in other European countries. Yes, Fariba, your struggle is ours.
Thank you so much, Béatrice, for this insightful speech. You have touched upon so many important, sensitive issues. So I guess there are some reactions in the room, or questions or comments that are mostly welcome. The first one is always most difficult to start. Of course, you have addressed many different dimensions in various contexts. We have microphones here at your disposal. Of course, the Iran and Middle East situation and the situation in authoritarian regimes is quite different from the one in our democracies and rule of law countries, even though the attacks, you have shown it very well, are general, I would say. It's une offensive générale. So, Mr. Chair of the ECPR, please, David.
This is working, is it? Oh, it is, yes.
Yep. It is.
Béatrice, thank you so much for your very stimulating remarks. There's a lot to think about in what you said. And when Sabine introduced the topic today, before you spoke, she pointed out that in the ECPR Executive Committee, we put a lot of stress right now on trying to develop a strategy relating to academic freedom. So quite honestly, it's something we're struggling with. We're getting on with it. We have drawn up some plans and we hope to have something up on our website quite soon. But I'm just curious, and forgive me for putting you on the spot if you like, but do you have a view about what political science associations like ours should be doing in this space? Is there more we could be doing in your view?
Thank you very much for this. Shall we take several questions, or we start maybe with this one, because it's an important one? Je pense que tu peux prendre ce micro-là. Tu appuies sur le petit bitonio-là. Voilà.
Yes, thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. I'm Liza Mugge from the University of Amsterdam. And we are, together with Fibeke Wang, we are doing a workshop on violence in politics and against political actors. But what keeps coming up in our conversations is our safety as scholars when we're doing the research. So for instance, each time when I speak out on the violence against oftentimes women politicians of color in the media, then I get abused myself online. So you've been talking about violence of the state against scientists, but what about the violence that we get as scientists from society and oftentimes from actors that are invisible because it happens online and it's really, really scary. And we are struggling with that. I'm not sure what the ECPR can do about that or institutions, but it is a thing and it is hard for us, and especially for women, younger women, it's terrifying and it's problematic because it is so important that we as scholars are publicly visible and that we engage in the public debate, especially now in these polarized politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another one? Please raise your hands. Don't be shy. No, so we start with the first two.
So thank you very much for this question. So the first one is very difficult because for 4 years we are thinking what to do, what to ask for association to do and so on. So the first thing that I think that make public situation is very important. For a long time, for example, at the beginning when Roland and Fariba were arrested, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs asked us to not speak about. And very rapidly we decided to speak. And I think that it was, for us, it was a good thing because even if it's not us, friends, colleagues, association that can make Fariba or anyone else free, it's important to make the authorities, the French authorities, the Western authorities, and the Iranian authorities aware of our mobilization. Then it's very important for the people that are in prison because, in fact, everything is known in prison, not in time, but for example, when Roland was freed, it was Fariba that asked us, tell us, before a lawyer and before the French embassy. So in the prison, there is the information circulates. So it's very important for giving force to the prisoners and for their families. And also, I think, and this is the big question for Fariba, it's also important to show in countries like Iran what is science, what is, for example, political science or anthropology, and to try to make clear that science is not espionage, that we don't have anything to be afraid to give publicly and so on. So I think that this kind of thing of making this question public, talking about it, it's very important. The rest, I don't know, because, for example, some associations have written letters to Iranian authorities and so on. I don't know, really, I don't know if this has any effect. So, but it cannot be bad. So I think that it's always a good thing. And then the third thing is to talk as we are talking about academic freedom or scientific freedom, because I think that we always think it's very far, it's Iran, it's Egypt, but no, we are seeing that when in France you are criminalizing someone that is doing research on jihad or Islam, political Islam, it's really very dangerous. So I think that it's also important to show that it's not so only a question for exotic and remote areas. So I will respond like that. I don't know if it can help you, but the second question, yes. So my discourse was very long, so I did not want to to be longer. But you are right. The attacks are not only from the state and not only from our community, but on society and of course, social networks, but also medias in general. And here I am, in fact, very embarrassed because I think it's very difficult. In one hand, I think that going to the medias precisely to show this distinction between conviction, judgment, and research is absolutely important, and we have to do this. It's our job, and as Weber said, to show what is behind judgments and what are the consequences of this judgment or that judgment. But at the same time, I think it is very difficult to do this because I have seen this because I work on Tunisia, Morocco, so all this problem of political Islam. I know how it's difficult in an ideological moment when Islam is bad, for example, to make our voice listen even. So, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I am very ambivalent. In a way, I think it's absolutely important. We have to do this, and it's also our job, because our job as researcher is to show what is behind judgment, one of the objectives of the research. But at the same time, often we are very disarmed in front of the violence. So my response is not a response, it's only I have not savoir-faire, I have not but it's a big issue.
Yes, it is a big issue indeed. Another question, otherwise I have one myself, which is a prolongation of what was just said, about knowledge, because we are producers of knowledge, as you said, or different sorts of knowledge, but all social sciences or hard sciences are producers of knowledge. And in our societies, even the democracies, don't we have this problem that we are said to be knowledge societies and economies, and investing in R&D is supposed to be the source of economic growth and the future social development. And at the same time, there are more and more movements, ideas on social networks, but not only, which are anti-knowledge, anti-vax, and at a certain moment, and anti-everything. So knowledge being something of the elites, well, how do we do with that? Because in fact, this anti-knowledge attitude is growing also among our political leaders and our political masters on both sides, by the way.
My idea is that we have to, I don't know, I am thinking with you, but all this rise of anti-knowledge are based on a fundamental doubt. And I think that maybe if we started from this, that is shared with research, scientific research, is based on doubt. To make discussion and to put in that also this anti-knowledge, and to go and to show what are the judgments, the conviction, the values lying under this anti-knowledge. It's a way of, I think that we cannot have mépris.
These guys.
Yes.
Disdain.
Position. I think that we have to discuss from a juncture that is this fundamental doubt, and showing that the doubt has to be shared and has to be and going to show that behind anti-knowledge tendency there is also things that can be put in doubt. So doing the same approach that they are doing on research, but it's very theoretical what I am saying, but it's a question again, and it's why my last point was about ideology. I think that today's often it's neoliberalism, and today's situation is presented as a moment without ideology. I think that we have ideology everywhere, and that is the point that we have to discuss as scientific researchers
and with critical thinking, indeed. Any other question? Yes, please. Over there. 2 questions. Yes, please.
Hello, I want to make a short comment. I'm Canan Özbey, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher from Turkey. I am one of the signatories of the petition that was announced with the title of Academics for Peace in 2016, which you also referred in your speech. This signature led to threats by the president and mafia leaders, a trial in court, being fired from my job, and having my passport confiscated for 5 years. And after 5 years, I got my passport, but my legal struggle continues to return to my job. It is the academic collaboration of the Collège de France, Sciences Po Toulouse, and its laboratory LASP that is having me here today. For this reason, your speech was not only important for solidarity with Fariba, but also personal for me. And I would like to thank you very much for your solidarity for academic freedom and your speech here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it makes me think that one thing to respond for you is the solidarity. And I think that the POSE program, I am part of the Scientific Council of POSE, is very important. And it's and you have also scholar artists and so on. But the program POSE was very important because it's not only to put the names of the person, but to have financement on this program, and also the universities, because the program is, I don't know if you know the program, but the program is half funding by POSE program and half by the universities. So this program of solidarities are very important to make possible the continuation of research in a situation that we cannot have anymore. And so like that. So I think it was a fourth point that the associations can do.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. Another question over there? Or comment or sharing?
Hi, thank you so much for your speech. I thought it was very interesting. My name is Rebecca Marvig and I'm at Columbia University in New York. And I really appreciated your comment that academic freedom is not only attacked in like other places what we consider, I don't know, authoritarian regimes, but also in the Western world. And specifically your speech reminded me of a colleague of mine who I just talked to recently who teaches in Florida and used to teach critical race theory, and then told me that now like they have to submit their syllabi to review if they're like teaching any critical race theory or any gender studies, and like. But then the interesting thing was that she told me that they still teach the same things, that now they just phrase it in different terms. So now they teach a course on freedom and equality, and like teach the same thing. So I was wondering what you thought about that. If you think that there's kind of like a trend towards kind of like a Straussian way of like rephrasing your research, and if there's a tension between this like speaking up for social science or like explaining what it is, or in the other way, kind of introducing your science through the back door. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Skillful academics are always good at playing with titles, aren't we?
We are always playing with titles and so on. I think, yes, it's, I don't know, because it's more a comment than really a question. I don't know how to respond because, of course, we always play with constraints. I work, for example, on Morocco, and I have always said what I wanted to say, but I know that I have to tell some very sensitive things in a certain way. For example, I don't talk about colonization of the Western Sahara, but I explain exactly colonization. So it's the same thing that you are saying about race or gender theory and talking inequality. So I think that it's sometimes, or even a lot of time, most time, you cannot do in another way. But maybe it's problematic because it doesn't go through the problem or what is at stake really. So I think it's a very delicate situation. Or yes, we have to go around constraints, but doing that, we have to stay really without losing the big point. So if it's only talking with another word, but saying the same, it's fine. But we have to be aware of not sliding and undermining the argument. So I think it's really un chemin de crête, as you say in French.
Voilà, exactly. Another question or comment? I think we are reaching the time to resume. 1, 2, 3, pas, c'est bon.